John Paul, some call him hero, some call him pirate. He himself called him Jones. For many, he is the father of the American Navy, although there are 3 daddies to this family.
You are not the father.
Born on July 6, 1747, and raised in Scotland, he became a sailor at the age of 13. His career started aboard the Friendship under one Captain Benson, which sounds pretty child-friendly, but considering it was the 1800s, it was probably just as tailored towards kids as actually partaking in Bring Your Child to Work Day in an industrial laundromat department. Even though he was more diligent than the contemporary Scottish 13-year-old, he still shared a teenager's main motivation for actually doing anything: bringing in the dough. So, he sailed for several years aboard a number of merchant vessels, making quite a profit, and also... Wait, can we say that? Can we really say that?
Yeah, you can say that, yes, it's okay.
Okay. Transporting slaves at times. He was young and needed the money. From time to time, he visited his brother William in Virginia to have some fun, like old times in their childhood, before his brother's wife would eventually call the boys' night off prematurely. This stable life went on for a bit, but after a while being docked at Jamaica, he suddenly decided, oh fuck it, quit. And so he left and made his way back to Scotland. Yet of course, like the seawater addict that he was, he couldn't stop. And after both of his captains died of yellow fever on his next voyage on board the brig John, he thought, well, it already got my name on it. So he took command, got the vessel safely back to port, and was rewarded handsomely by the owners, and was even made master of the ship he saved. For now, he was safely back in the saddle. Not for long though, as they sailed to the West Indies in the year 1770, the crew got disgruntled. The wage should be discussed, and if not, there would be mutiny. John Paul wasn't having it. It was his ship. Have they not seen the giant name tag on it? So he ended the discussion prematurely, like his sister-in-law did with game night, and flogged one of the crew members. Oh my, the people said. That may be a bit harsh. And perhaps it was, since the man died a few weeks later. And it wasn't any old poor commoner. No, the man was a reputable and influential Scottish adventurer. So JP went to prison. Then suddenly he decided, fuck it, I quit, and he was released on bail. He left Scotland, got command of a Londoner ship named Betsy, and returned to earning a living, until the crew got disgruntled and demanded to discuss the wages. Having already dealt with these kinds of situations, he fell back on tested solutions, only this time with a sword. And suddenly Scotland, with all these pent-up consequences, didn't look so bright anymore. So he quit it. America became the country of his fond election, perhaps due to the infinite possibilities in God's given country. Or because his brother had died and left him a house he could flee to. Anyway, he left behind his earned fortunes and pressed the restart button. To reinforce the change, he added Jones to his name and became a different man. As a career changer in America, he tried to use his previous experience with slaves to try working a plantation. He also was elected to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia.
I do not discuss wages, therefore I am.
In 1775, however, the sea called out to him once more. And maybe there was a spark of revolutionary spirit rising up in him, reflecting America's disposition, as a discussion about taxes was alright, and nothing like a degenerate discussion about wages. Whatever the case, he volunteered to serve in the newly found Continental Navy, and since he had made at least some headlines in maritime trade journals, there were people who knew of his abilities. First and foremost, Richard Henry Lee, one of the men who would later become the founding fathers of America. Besides, on board of the frigate USS Alfred, he could pay the Brits back, who had shown no appreciation of his quick-witted interpretation of employment law. Funnily enough, he was the first man to ever hoist a US ensign, at this time the Grand Union flag, over a naval vessel. Pretty cool, huh? So cool in fact that it only took the Continental Navy one defeat handed to them by the Brits to get him his own ship again. That being only a sloop, a very tiny boat, one could easily interpret this as insulting to this fine gentleman's skills. But he took command of the ship as part of a deal, as he was promised to later command one of the new frigates that were being constructed for the new navy, a proposition he could accept. One of his successes as commander of this sloop, the USS Providence, was the raid on a valuable British fishing village in Nova Scotia. There he destroyed 15 vessels and damaged the infrastructure on shore. He took most of the remaining fishing vessels with him and plundered everything that was not nailed down. And because the raid had turned out in his favor, he decided to just do it a second time. And this time around, he even managed to free 300 Americans imprisoned in British coal mines. 3 American men in British coal mines? Unheard of. Unacceptable. Just imagine the wages. We free these men or die trying. Yes, Commodore Hopkins. So Jones set sail to enact the rescue mission. But then winter hit, and he quit on the attempt. But not before they captured a vessel transporting the winter clothing supply for the British troops in Canada. Bloody hell! When do you think we got these new scarves already? Despite all the apparent accomplishments at sea, JP really wasn't that green with all this filthy authority standing above him in the food chain. So when he arrived in Boston in mid-December of '76, he started feeding with Commodore Hopkins, accusing him of talking down his great plans. Commodore, could we? No. Commodore, may I suggest that we? No. Oh, Commodore, if you would just let me. No. Yeah, alright, dead weight, don't get all worked up. That's it, no chair at the adults' table for you. Then he was put on the reserve bank, while the others got to have fun with the cool gear. And not only did they not give him the cool, newly built ship, no, they gave him a small sloop again. They even got rid of the flag he was allowed to hoist first. On the same day, he was assigned his new scow and replaced it with a knockoff copy of the old, just to put salt into his wound. Assured that this new flag would only be a phase, he stopped pouting and went on with it. After all, the old world called again, and he was given orders to further the American cause in France. Once he arrived there, he met up with the American commissioners Silas Deane, Arthur Lee, and Benjamin Franklin. And you know what? These gentlemen actually listened to him. They actually rather enjoyed his strategic recommendations. Screw you, Hopkins! No. After a while, the three commissioners agreed to granting Jones the command of a frigate they had the Dutch constructing in Amsterdam. This was great news for Jones, who wasn't the happiest with his sloop, the Ranger. But alas, all things have consequences, and the British, while maybe not intentionally having it out for him, had it out for him. And as all the navies of the late colonial era were locked in a constant arms race, they weren't too happy about an American warship being built in their backyard. You know, it would be a shame if our friendly neighborhood suddenly became less friendly, wouldn't it? It would be a real shame indeed if we had to replace all the signs with "never was" lands. And after a period of exerting pressure, the Netherlands sold the frigate to France instead. I'm sure this will keep the frigate from threatening Britain and won't turn out as pointless at all, said Britain. Nevertheless, Jones was fated out of a glorious ship once again. He simmered down a little after this incident, and during this time he developed a close friendship with Benjamin Franklin and made BF his BF. A couple of months of relative silence later, the French and the Americans came to the conclusion that both of them hated the British equally and signed a treaty about it, with France formally recognizing the independence of the new American Republic. And since Jones had about the same energy as all the people commenting first in a YouTube comment section, his Ranger became the first American ship to be saluted by the French. A 9-gun salute fired from Captain... what's his name? From Captain Lamotte Piquet's flagship hailed the Ranger and his captain. Jones later wrote, "I accepted his offer all the more, for after all it was a recognition of our independence." With his confidence re-established, he set sail towards the western coasts of Great Britain. He started out by skirmishing around the Irish Sea, attacking, disrupting, and seizing British merchant shippings. Later, though, he persuaded his crew to assault Whitehaven, the town where his maritime career had begun all those years prior. Not all of his crewmen were excited about the idea, though, and under the encouragement of some senior officers, it became somewhat of a difficult decision. Jones later reported these officers that instead of encouraging the morale of the crew, they excited them to disobedience. Whether this idea of an assault of his town of relative origin was a form of enacting personal payback or not, contrary winds forced the Ranger to abandon its course and drove it back to Ireland. They defaulted to continuing causing trouble for British merchants. At the approximately same time, the Royal Navy sloop HMS Drake anchored off Carrickfergus. After Jones had learned about the close-by position of the ship, he devised a plan to quickly attack the ship while it was in home waters. It should be a quick attack, he concluded, if necessary, in broad daylight. Yet his sailors were again unwilling to undertake it. Jones omitted this from the official report, however, as such naysayers would never besmirch his reputation again. The attack took place just after midnight. The plan was simple: get up and close, drop the anchor to hold the Ranger right alongside the Drake and attack as swiftly as possible. But the man responsible for dropping the anchor misjudged the timing due to the obscure and dark conditions. Jones even claimed the man had been drunk. The plan going up in flames, Jones had no choice but to cut the anchor cable and get out of there as fast as possible. So now that the plan had failed, they were back to raiding Whitehaven again. The number of ships anchored in Whitehaven that night is estimated to be between 200 and 400 wooden vessels, the bulk of which were merchant ships and coal transporters. Jones and his men wanted to try setting them on fire and sink all of the ships while they were immobilized by virtue of being anchored. They also hoped that the fires would terrorize the townspeople and disorganize them. They watered 2 boats and made their way to shore. Even though it was difficult to row towards the harbor, as shifting winds and a strong ebb tide made the undertaking difficult, they managed to land. One boat had rowed towards the northern fort, protecting the harbor, while the other, commanded by Jones, aimed to disrupt the defenses of the southern fortification. He successfully spiked the town's defensive guns, which prevented them to be used against the Ranger later on. But the northern boat did not even attempt an attack, with its sailors claiming to have been frightened away by a noise. The plan, however, was still on, even though lighting fires proved difficult. The lanterns in both boats had run out of fuel. "No worries, men. There is nothing that can't be solved by a good night in a pub." And to search for fire sources, Jones sent some of the party to raid a public house on the quayside, where they actually stopped for a quick drink and delayed the ongoing raid. By the time they returned, dawn was already breaking, and by now everything had gone south. Still, Jones ordered to light the fires. And so the fires were lit in the southern fort. Their efforts were concentrated on the coal ship Thompson, with the idea that the flames would spread to adjacent vessels, which were grounded by a low tide. During this attempt, and in the obscure conditions of twilight, one of the crew slipped away and alerted the residents of what was going on. The fire alert was sounded, and large numbers of people came running, forcing the Americans to retreat. As saving grace, the people's attempt to sink the Ranger with cannon fire was made impossible by the successful sabotaging during the night. While Jones had to fall back and regroup, the flames engulfed and ultimately consumed the entire town. This ill-executed attack is known today as the only American raid on English shorelines during the entire American Revolution. As JP couldn't let it stand with such a half-baked attack, he came up with another plan. And after his crew weren't too keen on sailing to Tahiti and growing mangoes there, he continued to his home region of Cockatbright Bay. So after the attack on the town of birth of his career had failed, he tried to get back at his actual place of birth. Revenge may be an idiot's game, but Jones wasn't much of a player anyway. Well, that, or perhaps it was only due to him being familiar with the region and him hoping to garner some advantage from that. The scheme that Jones had come up with was to capture the local Earl of Selkirk, who lived on a nearby isle. He hoped to ransom the Earl in exchange for American sailors captured by the British and pressed into the service of the Royal Navy. They discovered, however, that the Earl was absent during the attack, and so it fell to his wife to negotiate with Jones and his men. They stole, or rather, for those of you who pay attention to semantics, took almost all his silver, including his wife's teapot, her breakfast tea still inside. Unbeknown to the raiders at that time, one sack of silver was half filled with coal by the family butler, something the newer generation would describe as a W. After they had talked everything out, Jones claims that he intended to return to his ship and continue raiding elsewhere. But his crew allegedly wished to
Pillage, burn, and plunder all we could.
So he allowed them to take a silver plate set decorated with the noble family's emblem and declared the affair to be settled. Because the D in John Paul Jones stands for defeat and the G for giving up, this master and commander of the high seas wanted to try taking the HMS Drake again. After all, the first failed attempt was nothing more than a learning opportunity. And so, the ships engaged in combat. They were roughly equal in terms of firepower, so the battle could drag out. From an earlier captured reconnaissance boat, Jones had learned that the Drake had taken on dozens of soldiers, intending on grappling and boarding the Ranger. He would make sure that this would not come to be, and after an hour-long gun battle and the delivery of fatal wounds to the British ship's captain and lieutenant, Jones actually managed to capture the Drake. He gave his own lieutenant command of the vessel and ordered to return to Brest. But alas, the ships that escorted him separated away during the return journey, as Jones wanted to chase more prizes. His lieutenant, named Simpson, was not very happy with that greedy decision and started to criticize Jones for that, explaining said departure. Still, they both arrived at port safely. Jones immediately filed for court-martial of his Lieutenant Simpson, keeping him locked up on the ship in the meantime. At this stage in his life, Jones had no more time for complaints and insubordination. There was glory and value to gain. After all, everybody thought of themselves as a critic these days. But exactly this philosophy sparked controversy around him. Not only was Lieutenant Simpson released from Jones' accusations by the influence of one Commissioner John Adams. No, this John Adams even implied that Jones was hoping to monopolize on the mission's glory by detaining his lieutenant. The fact was that his crew felt alienated by their commander, as a discourse about his intentions started to erupt, with many claiming he had only been motivated by pride and greed, while Jones believed his intentions to be honorable and integral to the revolution. Whatever the intention, the capture of the HMS Drake remains one of the few significant military victories the Continental Navy could produce in the revolution, proving the effectiveness of not giving a shit. After an equivalent amount of rejection like you get from a dad on the mission to receive milk regarding getting a new ship, Jones finally, and in contrast to the milk, got what he wanted. The French were planning a potential invasion of Britain and were therefore happy to arm Jones and give him every bit of support that they could. He took command of the USS Bonhomme Richard, an East India merchant ship rebuilt and outfitted with 42 guns by the French, now given over to the US. As Spanish and French forces prepared for an invasion of the British Isles, Jones was tasked with leading a 5-ship squadron to divert the attention of the Redcoats and their colonization machinery. And it seemed to work, as several Royal Navy warships were sent in pursuit of Jones. But the curse of insubordination still plagued him, and if the same thing happens to you over and over again, it is clearly not your own fault, but everybody else's. As a result of this revelation, one ship left Jones' squadron again. Not that he cared, but they were down to 4. Still, they continued into the North Sea. I am Convoy 400 here, I just want to check with you. Do you see what I see? Starboard side. Yeah, looks like hostile vessels. Oh well, I thought it would be hostile vessels! This was a beautiful sight in the eyes of not at all a pirate, Jones. A large merchant convoy, ripe for the taking. But what was this? Battleships putting themselves between us and the prize? Preposterous. Typical enemy trick, isn't it, Captain? And even though the merchant ships escaped them like a president escapes a fatal bullet by virtue of someone else jumping in front of them, Jones made a daring and of his character absolutely untypical decision. He did not quit. On the contrary, he would fight. The men of the Bonhomme Richard were aware that they were no match for the newer and more heavily armed Serapis, which would be their opponent in this battle, while the other ships around them also engaged in a fight. Yet, the distance between the two was continuously being closed, until they had drawn close enough together that the men on both ships could hear the orders being given on the other ship. Shortly after 7 p.m, the first cannon was fired, with both ships firing broadsides. Later, the Serapis got off 3 full broadsides, resulting in massive devastation on the deck of the Bonhomme Richard. Jones concluded that their only chance would be to board the Serapis and take control in hand-to-hand combat. But this boarding attempt failed. The Serapis followed up with a ramming maneuver, but also failed at this attempt. Due to this, both vessels became entangled with each other, and Jones had therefore been successful in his attempt to close the gap for boarding maneuvers to be possible.
Do you think he plans it all out? Or just makes it up as he goes along?
In the ongoing duel, both crews fired rigorously at each other from point-blank range, causing the destruction of the Richard's main artillery pieces, resulting in them almost being completely wiped out. It was reported that Jones yelled, "I may sink, but I'll be damned if I strike," over the roaring battlefield. But while the battle seemed dire below deck, they actually gained traction above. Jones' sailors stationed in the top, the upper end of the masts, managed to push their British counterparts off of the upper decks. At this stage of the engagement, the USS Alliance, one of Jones' allies, tried to intervene in the one-on-one, firing 3 broadsides in their general direction, hitting the Serapis as well as the Richard, resulting in deaths on both sides. The commander of the British side, Sir Richard Pearson, used this shell-shocked state to shout towards Jones, "Have you struck?" being an old Navy way of asking if he was ready to surrender. And even though the answer is a bit debated, he allegedly rebutted, "I have not yet begun to fight." True or not, he clearly responded with some manifestation of the word no, which can be concluded due to the onslaught of continued gunfire. After the battle had lasted for 3.5 hours, looking like it would last at least double that amount, a lucky American grenade found its way into an open hatch, fell into the British battery deck and exploded a series of arms magazines. Captain Pearson had no choice but to strike his colors and surrender. Jones had won. The Bonhomme Richard, however, was too damaged to survive any longer. The ship sunk to the depth the following day after tomorrow. He repaired the Serapis to the best of their ability, and then they sailed off into the sunset with victory in their sails. The following year, King Louis XVI honored him with the title Chevalier, making him a knight in France. All the while, a gold medal was struck in the US in commemoration of his valor and brilliant services. In Britain, however, he was denigrated as a pirate.
John Paul Jones is a pirate, no loyalty does he possess. Keep it up, we'll catch the pirate and sink him along with the rest.
After a long series of losing out on ship commands and assignments, Jones was left without prospects and active employment. Until one day, when he decided to quit this BS and went on with it. He then entered the service of her Empress Catherine II of Russia, who held him in high regards, proclaiming that he will get to Constantinople. Yet, he never quit on his American citizenship and US officer status, which will become essential later in this story. He took part in a naval campaign in the Dnieper-Bug-Leman, an arm of the Black Sea, against the Turks, in cooperation with the flotilla commander Prince Charles of Nassau-Siegen. They repulsed the Ottoman forces, but by now his inaptitude for politics and his attitude towards authority were no matter of surprise anymore. As such, he turned a Russian commander, Prince Grigory Potemkin, against him. Since JP was a bit anti-establishment as always, the establishment tried to put some distance between them and Jones. He was recalled to St. Petersburg for a transfer to a command in the North Sea, essentially getting him as far away as possible. The fact that some naval officers supporting this transfer were of British origin, only now in Russian employment, may or may not have been related to this outcome. These officers regarded Jones as a renegade and often refused to speak to him, which probably led to a whole series of awkward moments. And speaking of awkward moments, in April of the year 1789, Jones was accused of sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl named Katerina Stepanova. What a segue, huh? Katerina testified to the police that Jones had summoned her to his apartment to sell him butter, and then, presumably, the little King Harlows uppercutted her in the face, gagged her with a white handkerchief, and are we allowed to say this? I just want to make sure of this, you know?
Just say it. Just say it, you know?
Okay, yeah. Then he vaginally penetrated her. Allegedly. It wasn't looking too bright for Jonesy Boy, as both a surgeon and a midwife had stated that they had found evidence of these events. There only was a teeny tiny problem to it all. Katerina Stepanova had waited a full day before reporting the rape, which meant the case would not continue. You see, in Russia, due to its statutory codes, this delay would have been considered evidence of consent. But Empress Catherine II intervened personally in the case, allowing the investigation to proceed. After all, she had such confidence in him before. Surely, if he was innocent, then it would come out as such. Jones responded to the allegations by claiming that he had in fact paid the girl for intercourse several times. He denied robbing her of her virginity and proclaimed that she was surely older than 10, like a true lolly anime enjoyer. This story, however, changed at a later point in time. He went on with the claim that Katerina's mother was behind it all to gain financially from a prominent man. Jones involved his last friend in the Russian capital, Louis de Ségur, and asked him to investigate the matter. This count claimed that the whole ordeal was nothing but a plot by Prince Charles, the flotilla commander from before, to disgrace Jones. As the investigation went on, the accused Jones called up Katerina's father to testify that his daughter was actually 12, making the whole thing much more morally acceptable, and that her mother lived in a brothel, making her moral integrity debatable at best. By now you probably gained quite a mental knot in your deductions, with accusations flying left and right. So let me contact our internal legal team so that we can sort out this muddy dispute. Ah, right. We have no legal team. The international pressure applied, both by American and French friends, activated through the Count de Ségur, ensured that good old Kathy could be persuaded to grant Jones 2 years abroad, effectively exiling him. He arrived in Warsaw, where he befriended a veteran of the American Revolutionary War. This veteran advised him to quit on Russia, make use of his skills at sea and serve another naval power, like for example Sweden. And while Jones found the prospect of quitting another misfortunate situation quite alluring, Catherine used her influence to block him not only from supporting the Swedes, but also the Danes, just to be safe. Because we don't want the Danes to rediscover their lust for sea raids with an accomplished sea raiding captain.
Skjøgel! Skalmel! Skilder klovner! Skjøgel! Skalmel!
Bitter and broken, Jones arrived in Paris in the year 1790. He still retained his position as Russian Rear Admiral, which came along with a hefty pension, allowing him to retire without financial issues. Even though he tried to re-enter Catherine's services, she did not answer his letters. His record isn't that exceptional for me to ignore the past. Regardless, Russia's men refused to serve under him. 2 years later, he was appointed as a US consul to treat with the Dey of Algiers for the release of American captives. But before he could fulfill his new appointment, he was found dead, lying face down on his bed in his third-floor Paris apartment, number 19, Rue de Tournon, on July 18, 1792. He was 45 years old. The cause of death being interstitial nephritis. A small procession walked his body 4 miles. He was buried in Paris at the Saint Louis Cemetery, belonging to the royal family. 4 years later, France's revolutionary government sold the property, and the cemetery, alongside Jones, was forgotten. Books based upon his adventures were published, such as The Pilot and Captain Paul, and the world slowly remembered him. Horace Porter, US ambassador in France, searched for 6 years to track down the body of Jones using faulty burial records. It turned out from these, however, that his body had been mummified, preserved by alcohol and interred in a lead coffin. It was made in this way in the event that should the United States decide to claim his remains, they might more easily be identified. So Porter knew what to look for, and with the aid of an old map of Paris and his expert search team, he rediscovered the site of the former cemetery. Sounding probes were used to search for lead coffins, and in the end, 5 coffins were exhumed. After inspection, it was found that in the third, unearthed on April the 7th, 1905, the body of Jones had remained for over 100 years. The remains were brought to the United States aboard the USS Brooklyn, escorted by 3 other cruisers, effectively composing Jones's last voyage. Approaching the American coastline, 7 US battleships joined the procession. The coffin was installed in Bancroft Hall in Annapolis, Maryland, with President Theodore Roosevelt holding a speech paying tribute to the old captain. There he remains until now, in a bronze and marble sarcophagus, placed inside the Naval Academy Chapel, with the names of his ships engraved on the floor beneath his resting place. By the turn of the millennia, he was actually pardoned by the port of Whitehaven for his raid on the town. And as a sweet side note, during his lifetime, Jones had bought the plate he and his crew had stolen during their raid on the Scottish noble estate in Kirkcudbright Bay, when it was later sold off in France, and he returned it to the Earl of Selkirk after the war was over. After all, if you want to enjoy the lyrics of the sea shanty John Paul Jones Was a Pirate, or you want to go to the Navy Academy and pay your respects to the old Navy captain, is up to you. The only sure thing, however, is that John Paul Jones was a deeply polarizing individual. He was an accomplished sea tactician with the occasional sparked greed of a privateer. He was a social scoundrel with a questionable record, to say the least, but also a strong-willed man who never backed down and, more importantly, never accepted a situation where he was on his back foot. Whether or not you want to regard John Paul Jones as a pirate or not is fully up to you. I have to thank you for your time, and I assure you, we will see each other in the next one. Until then, stay out of trouble, fellas. See ya.